along with our colleagues from TI Zambia, Tamika Halwiindi, and from TI South Africa, Corruption Watch, Mashudu Masutha. We're also fortunate to have Marcel, Korth from Anglo and Winifred Fitzgerald from Ambatovy joining us to share their reflections and experience engaging women. As we go, please do post any questions or comments in the chat. The speakers will be keeping an eye on them as we go. So, firstly, let me provide you with a brief overview of the Accountable Mining Program. And I should also mention we do have interpretation into French. So if you do need to access that interpretation, you can do that at the bottom of the screen. And just to ask our speakers to remember that we have interpreters working with us, so not to speak too fast. So first, let me provide an overview of our program. We are the Global Centre of Expertise on Mining for the Transparency International Movement based in Australia. And we work with our colleagues across 20 countries around the world in developed and developing economies as diverse as Zimbabwe, Mongolia, Canada, Argentina, Sierra Leone, and of course, South Africa and Zambia. The program is globally coordinated and locally embedded and has been running for 5 years. Our particular focus is on identifying and addressing corruption risks in the licensing, approval, and contracting stage of the mining value chain, looking at the system for approvals and identifying vulnerabilities and risks. So we're at that very beginning point of the value chain. It's important to understand our definition of corruption and the definition that Transparency International uses, which is quite broad, and that will give you some context for the discussion today. We talk about corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for personal or political gain. So it is quite broad in terms of the way it's defined. Our program works through a multi-stakeholder approach with civil society, community, industry, and governments, leveraging our local presence to inform our global action. Our foundational tool is the Mining Awards Corruption Risk Assessment Tool, and particularly relevant for this webinar is the news that the new version of that tool produced at the end of last year integrates gender across the tool. That tool allows you to do research to identify the corruption risks and vulnerabilities in the approvals process. And our chapters, our country officers, are then able to take action to address the risks that they have found. As I mentioned, one of the increasing areas of priority for our program has been working on the intersection between gender, corruption, and mining. This is an area that's not well researched and not well considered, but deserves particular focus in terms of the importance of the issues that we're addressing tonight. So certainly for our program, tackling the root causes of corruption in mining approvals will contribute to improving development outcomes for women and girls. Empowering women and promoting their participation in public life is essential, not only to address the gendered impact of corruption, but also to address unequal gender relations. So in terms of the focus of the program and the focus that we have found in the work that we've done on the intersection between mining, gender, and corruption, we really focus on two issues and two areas. We focus on policy and we focus practically. In terms of policy, we really focus on ensuring that the gendered impacts of in mining approvals are understood and considered. Corruption is not gender and is not gender neutral, and there are some very particular impacts. Practically, we focus on ensuring that women are able to participate and raise their voices as advocates for change to address corruption, identifying and addressing the barriers to women's equal participation. So in terms of some of the gendered impacts, and my colleagues will be able to give more specific information in relation to their experiences in their countries, but just to give you some sense of what the gendered impacts of corruption in mining look like, some examples that we've found in the research that we do. For instance, we've seen that when the requirements for community consultation as part of environmental and social impact assessment processes are ignored or manipulated, because they're not properly enforced, the specific impacts of a proposed mining project on women will not be identified and will not be mitigated. Negative health and social impacts that will affect women more include the risk of increased violence against women and greater burdens of care for women due to increased water pollution. It's a particular way in which a corrupt act will have a particular impact on women. We've also seen that when negotiations for community development agreements only take place between men, male traditional leaders, and often men as male company executives or representatives, despite a requirement for community participation, women are more likely to miss out on the benefits for mining. We've also seen that when companies or processes mislead governments and others about their environmental impact and management plans so that they're able to obtain a license, there is a high risk of serious impacts on the availability of clean water, wood, fuel, and agricultural land. And women in local communities are often especially dependent on these resources in their traditional gender roles. So the way in which these corrupt acts manifest for women is particularly serious and deserves particular attention. So we focus first on highlighting those intersections and those issues, and then secondly, as I mentioned, on addressing the practicalities. How can women be more involved? We know that women are often excluded, intentionally or unintentionally, from the consultation process in relation to new mining projects or expansions, which means their perspectives and concerns are not considered and they're unable to fulfill their role as agent for change. They miss the opportunity to hold leaders to account. They miss the opportunity to ensure that the impact on women is considered in any deals that are negotiated. And they miss the opportunity to protect their rights to land and to compensation. Our program has a strong focus on community participation and meaningful engagement with the licensing process, which is important to address corruption risks in the licensing process for a range of reasons. We have a publication in relation to community engagement and corruption risk, which we'll share the link for, and you can look at that. And I encourage you to look at the various links that my colleague Lisa has been putting in the chat for our program. We know that if action is effectively taken, then women's meaningful participation can be secured, and we're very happy to have our colleagues here to share some of their experiences with us this evening. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Lisa, who'll be facilitating the discussion. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Nicole, and hello to everybody who is in the session today. So now we're going to hear from two of the participating Transparency International chapters, followed by some industry representatives. So we'll start with Tamika Halwiindi from TI Zambia, and then Masutha from Corruption Watch South Africa. I'll ask our TI chapters to address a couple of questions, and then we'll move to the industry representatives. So Tamika, considering the work that you've done in this area to improve natural resource governance, can you tell us about some of the gendered corruption risks that you've identified in Zambia?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I hope you could hear me all right. And I'm just really happy to be here to share experiences and thoughts with everyone who's joined the session. So as Nicole stated, Transparency International Zambia has been an implementing country for the Accountable Mining Program. And because of the program, our work has mostly concentrated on mining decision-making, so that's consultations before mining, environmental impact assessments, and resettlement processes. And we have put efforts to use a gender lens to assess these processes. And through our work, we have learned that when mining decisions, particularly where participation and consultation is involved, are happening in a manner that's not transparent or corruption is involved, women are normally excluded from the process. So this happens with traditional leaders when mining first approach traditional leaders for license to mine or during the environmental impact assessments. So when these consultations are not transparent, when they're not inclusive or corruption is involved, mining decisions are agreed upon which do not reflect women's best interests in these communities. In a similar manner, when licenses are granted in a non-transparent manner and end up in the hands of environmentally and socially irresponsible mining companies, we have seen that women bear the brunt environmentally and socially. And some of these effects include the first one, which normally occurs, is loss of access to land for mining. And we do note that most women, especially in rural areas in Zambia, depend on this land for farming. So when mining happens and women are excluded, their loss to land is difficult to be compensated, mostly because this land is customary land, but also because women, in Zambian tradition, it's weird, women don't necessarily own land, but they use the land. If you know what I mean, most of the land is owned by men, but you do find that women are involved in most of the farming activities. Additionally, socially, you will find that women are in charge of most household chores, so getting water, wood for firewood. And so when mining affects water sources or limits access to forests, women do bear the brunt of these effects because they're the primary caregivers and they're the people who are in charge of household chores. At the same time, when you look at access to land and the loss thereof due to mining, and because women are not included or consultant, you'll find that women's livelihoods and economic activities are interrupted and disadvantaged. And then, of course, additionally, when there is pollution from mining, this affects the health of the communities, and you will find that women as caregivers have to spend more time at home looking after the sick. So you do find that women are affected differently from men in terms of mining, especially when mining is done in a way that's not responsible. And so in this way, we can connect corruption or the lack of transparency in mining decisions to how that affects women differently and disproportionately. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks for that, Tamika. I've just got a follow-up question. If you have just a couple of minutes to respond. So with that in mind and based on your experience then in the program, if they're the problems, what have you seen as opportunities to strengthen the voice and agency of women, and what would that mean in the context of their voice and agency and participation in a multi-stakeholder group? Just a couple of minutes, thanks.
Thanks for that question, and I'll try to be quick. So as Transparency International Zambia, we do not work alone. We work with other CSOs, and we are a member of Publish What You Pay, which is represented on the multi-stakeholder group here in Zambia. And we've had conversations as a coalition of CSOs, and as Publish What You Pay, we've developed some gender documents that speaks to increased representation, but we cannot speak about strengthening the agency and voice of women on MSGs without increasing the number of women represented on MSGs. That's from government, mining industry, and civil society. And this representation should not only be about an increase in numbers, but then again, in several discussions we've had in a coalition and CSOs, one of the key concerns, which is usually brought up by men, is the capability of women to participate on the MSG. And this is from the recognition that work of the MSG can be quite technical. And so the fear is if you put women on the MSG and they don't have that expertise, then the work of any sector, be it government, ministry, industry, or civil society, their representation would be affected. But a key way to address this would really to build the capacity of women who sit on the MSG so that you strengthen their agency and voice. Yes, we want women to be represented. Yes, we want women in the room, but we do want them to be able to have a voice. I think women have continuously been left behind, and lack of expertise can be given as an excuse, but we need to have deliberate efforts to build the expertise of women who sits on the MSG, so that they can add value and contribute to decisions that are made. So we don't want women in the room only, we want women discussing and constructively participating in decision making. In Zambia, another way as CSOs, we are attempting to get women in the room or on the MFGs to nominate women as alternates to men. And this could be a slow step to progress so that women actually kind of get an opportunity to catch up on the much needed expertise. But efforts for increased participation need to be driven by all sectors. I think we cannot emphasize that enough. They need to be driven by government, by mining industry, and civil society. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Tamika, and some really important points there. It's not just about women being in the room and at the table, it's about them having a voice. And I really liked your point about ensuring that that expertise comes through. Indra's just put in the chat an invitation to write questions and comments. I will encourage you to do that. We might be able to address them as we go through the speakers. So please feel free to join others in the chat with your questions. I'll turn now to Mashudu. Mashudu, you're in South Africa. What are some of the barriers that you've seen, particularly within communities, that have hindered women from participating in efforts to make the mining sector more accountable?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, and really great to be with everyone. I hope you all can hear me okay. Yeah, I think, our work as Corruption Watch within the Accountable Mining Program, we've been able to really illustrate, on the one hand, that corruption, there are gendered impacts of corruption, but also on the other hand, that there is a very direct link, as my neighbor from TI Zambia pointed out, between corruption and corruption risks and how it affects women. And what we're seeing in South Africa, it can be from as broad ranging as illegal or irregular licenses being awarded, and the impact that it would have on government revenue, and then the obvious impact that it would have on social services and access to healthcare, to the more specific examples of, in communities where traditional leaders, which are most of the time male in South Africa, that reinforce social norms that exclude women in decision making and consultation and in community engagements with key stakeholders. But I think, what's important when we talk about, looking at the barriers and identifying the barriers and having a gendered response and initiative to it, is to sort of ensure that we look at the specificity of communities. So communities are not monolithic, they're dynamic, and there's complexity, and there's a lot of insights and data that you receive from that. So when you're looking at the specificity of things in communities, that's where you are able to move from identifying these vulnerabilities or these barriers that women are experiencing and moving towards becoming more solution orientated that is fit for purpose. So I'll give a quick example. There's one community, it's in Limpopo province here in South Africa, and Limpopo houses the eastern and northern limb of the platinum belt. So it's quite a lucrative province in terms of mining of PMGs. And this community is led by a woman. The woman is the chief. The woman, because of the new national law, will be the one who's required to consent to economic development that happens on her land. So in that instance, when we're talking about a gender responsiveness, in as much as the communities are sort of an outlier to the traditional aspects of what we receive, but the response to that and discussions about ensuring accountability in that space needs to be fit for that community.
That's a really important point. We can't treat all communities as homogenous, both in terms of the decision-making structure, but also just the gender dynamics, and something for us to keep in mind as Transparency International, but I suppose also for multi-stakeholder groups. Bringing it back then to the multi-stakeholder groups, in what ways has Corruption Watch been able to address some of these barriers to women's participation through the Accountable Mining Program? And similar to my question for Tamika, what lessons does that offer for multi-stakeholder groups and people on the call today?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Lisa. I think, from a macro perspective, South Africa is sort of a notable absentee to EITIs. But, I think there's I think South Africa being a legacy mining jurisdiction, there's a lot of insights that can be drawn on what communities and civil society have been able to do in terms of having multi-stakeholder groups. Within our work as Corruption Watch and communities, we have ensured that our engagement is holistic. So we ensure that we engage with private sector, with public sector, within communities, different levels of communities. And that again speaks to the point that was raised even by Tamika, is the specificity of communities. We need to understand the veracity of the vulnerability and the marginalization that happens, that is experienced by women. And in order for you to do that, you need to, yes, have the community engagements and have the data and the insight that you receive from communities, but you also need to engage with stakeholders that engage with the communities themselves. Because, women aren't, they don't just relate to the mining company or the mining right holder. They live within an ecosystem of people and have different relations, whether it's in their home life, in their lifestyle, and so on. And I think when you look at it that way, there's sort of a ensuring that you understand the barriers, and as well as looking at the specificity within communities. It sort of allows for a sequential process where you move effectively from identifying the problem to looking at what the solutions could be and who do you invite as stakeholders in that solution-making process. The reality, again, is that you need a wide range of stakeholders, because the role of women and the impact of not only mining, but societal norms in general affect women differently. So I'll give an example. We went to one of our case study communities is in the Northern Cape. It's one of our largest geographical provinces here in South Africa. And the reason why we picked this community was because on a survey, the number of women that participated in the survey was less than 5%. So we wanted to understand what is happening in the community, because we know there's women, but why are the women not participating in the survey, so we can understand the veracity of what the licensing process and how they're participating in it. When we went into the community, the issues that were affecting women to participate in the survey and participate in mining related processes was gender-based violence and alcohol abuse. So when we're talking about the vulnerabilities and issues that affect women in participating in processes, you need a wide range of stakeholders, because those kinds of issues are not mining specific necessarily, but you need a specialized skill set from other stakeholders. So it's important to have that, not only for identifying the issues, but also sustainability. So once you're not there, once you've provided the information, once you've provided the platform, there needs to be access that women have to the necessary people and the necessary platforms to have the kind of agency and continue to be accountability agents.
Thanks very much for that, Mashudu. I think for me, what really stood out there was just the importance of ensuring that women and a broad range of women stakeholders are part of that solution-making process, as you put it. So we might find that there are barriers and we can identify them, but in terms of overcoming them, well, that should involve the consultation and participation of those women themselves. So that's a really important message for us to take as well from the South African experience. We're going to turn now to hear from two industry representatives. So we'll actually start in South Africa, staying in South Africa. We'll start with Marcel from Anglo American and then turn to Winifred from Ambatovy in Madagascar. So Marcel is from Anglo American, and Marcel, can you tell us about the steps that Anglo American has taken to support women from affected communities to engage with you, with the company? And be interesting to know whether your approaches to addressing participation barriers are similar or different to some of the approaches that have been mentioned by Tamika and Mashudu. Thanks, Marcel.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. And thank you for having me. Just to say before we started thinking about how we can better engage with communities, and you've just said, Lisa, it's not just about engaging women, it's also about appreciating that there's a broad range of women, right? Just like communities are not homogeneous. So, in the same way, women is not a homogeneous group. But we've had to re-look at our policies overall, and our work in this space is now guided by a revised human rights policy, which is currently under review to actually make it more gender responsive and gender transformative. But so is other work of ours. So we are reviewing specific areas of our work to make them more gender responsive and gender transformative altogether. So our work in communities is guided by what we call the Social Way 3.0. And the Social Way is aligned with our human rights policy and integrates social and human rights impact analysis. So I thought I would quickly try to go through some of the key issues there. So firstly, the stakeholder engagement process is guided to identify stakeholders based on specific aspects, such as power dynamics, looking at marginalized groups, and I'm looking at the list just now. People facing barriers to attending meetings, people facing barriers to accessing information, language barriers, or people whose livelihoods or legal status are considered illegal. And based on that assessment, we then have special measures in place in how to respond to that identification. And that could include having a dedicated individual to liaise with a specific person or household, providing sensitivity training to our own staff on site, conducting home visits, identifying suitable time for engagements, providing various ways for people to access information. And undercurrent here is avoiding labeling or drawing attention to specific groups of people. There's some gender-specific considerations that guide these engagements, and that includes speaking to women separately, as well as speaking to women informally, where formal engagement isn't possible at that time. Identifying issue-specific opportunities for consultation, so issues where women have a specific perspective to contribute. Keeping traditional authorities informed, and Mashudu has just spoken a little bit to that. And of course, the patriarchal system there isn't helping, but navigating that carefully with the team on site and other professionals we have on board. And then, of course, being intentional about women participation in community engagement forums. And those bring with them all difficulties, that such big group gatherings bring. And then secondly, based on the initial stakeholder engagements, a stakeholder engagement plan is then developed for continuous engagement. And there, these aspects remain relevant. So those are some of the very specific aspects that I thought, that's how I understood the question, to really give some very specific ideas. I just want to quickly see in other areas in the community. So our work in communities is guided by our sustainable mining plan, which looks at building thriving communities, and there our focus is on health, education, and livelihoods. And in each one of these, to identify, needs based on disaggregated data, first of all, but also developing gender responsive and gender transformative interventions, for instance, in economic empowerment initiatives. Also, and that work is obviously guided by building partnerships on the ground. In response to COVID, we've also built a partnership in South Africa with the National Shelter Movement. But around the world, all our operations have identified local partners, CBOs and government partners, to establish initiatives. And that work is now ongoing. And in fact, we are moving in the violence space, we are moving more into violence prevention. And the last point is just, Nicole mentioned, or was it you, Lisa? I can't remember. Someone said, it's not just about having women in the room. You know, it's about driving a transformative agenda. And there, we've realized that it's really crucial to have the dialogue right across the business, from the CEO to the sites and to our community-facing colleagues on site. And that is something that's ongoing, to really have the kind of conversations within the business and with key partners outside the business that lead us there. And I've said it earlier on, you know, mainstreaming gender, and mainstreaming gender could, you know, may sound good, but it also obviously has more difficult connotations. But mainstreaming gender in our analysis and in our response plans very intentionally. Just on time, I think.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Marcel. And there's a lot to take in there. I'm sure there's probably several follow-up questions that people might like to address to you. But one thing I took that I think could be of particular relevance for EITI multi-stakeholder groups was about the importance of creating the right platforms in which to engage with women, as well as delivering the information in a way that is meaningful and relevant to them, given that the role of EITI is to enhance transparency. A one-size-fits-all approach to sharing information may end up excluding women. So I thought that was an important lesson to highlight. But without abusing my position as the moderator, I'll ask Winifred from Ambatovy in Madagascar to share a few words. So Ambatovy is a member of the EITI in Madagascar. And reflecting on the comments so far, Winifred, can you talk about how your company supports the multi-stakeholder group in Madagascar to improve the participation of women, but also related to that previous point, how the multi-stakeholder group is engaging itself with women? Winifred, I'll hand over to you to share some words.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is it coming through clearly?
That's fantastic.
Okay, thank you. I may turn off the video if it gets stuck. But thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to participate in this workshop today, representing both the company I work for, Ambatovy, a nickel and cobalt mining enterprise in Madagascar, as well as the Chamber of Mines of Madagascar. We are proud members of the EITI multi-stakeholder group here in Madagascar. It's also known as the National Committee in Madagascar. I think it's important to know that Madagascar, the large-scale industrial mining in Madagascar is relatively new and young. Madagascar has been an EITI candidate country for over 10 years now, since 2008. But as the sector seeks to develop, I think the multi-stakeholder group or the National Committee, the EITI process in general, can help ensure that we learn lessons from other countries that are further along in their mining, in the mining sector, that good practices are adopted, that mining is done in inclusive, responsible, and sustainable manner, and that a gender lens, particularly for the topic today, that a gender lens is adopted at all stages of this project. In Madagascar, the multi-stakeholder group, which is comprised, of course, of members of government, the administration, the civil society groups, and extractive companies. We currently have 21 members, and we have 8 of those are women, mostly representing extractives. That's been a tradition here, pretty much a tradition here, and we're proud of that we are well represented on the EITI. But that way we can, by having that, we can make sure that gender provisions of the EITI standard are put into practice, that we can adopt a gender sensitive approach in our EITI work plans, that we can emphasize the importance of having disaggregated data. Of the 8 women on the EITI National Committee, 4 are from the extractive sectors, and 3 are actually members or active members of the, including myself, of the Chamber of Mines. So we do have, we're in a position of influencing other companies that are not necessarily even formally on the EITI National Committee, but we can, are in a position to share information, share best practices about EITI and what it seeks to do. Ambatovy, we've been part of the national committee since Madagascar became a candidate country back in 2008, and for most of those years, our representative on the committee has been a woman.
Winifred,
just referring back to yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Are you able to speak a little bit slower for the interpreters?
Okay, I'm sorry. Certainly.
Thank you. That's okay. Not a problem.
Okay. So what can, how can Ambatovy and other mining companies in Madagascar support the MSG to improve the participation of women, and vice versa? How can the multi-stakeholder group help companies strengthen their engagement with women? I think to touch on some of my predecessors on this panel's points, I think it's very important, obviously, in the public consultation during the EIA, the environment and social impact assessment process, and the resettlement process at the outset, when projects are being developed and decided, developed, and built. But obviously, consultation and meaningful engagement needs to be throughout the life of a mining project, not just at the early stages. That's critical to lay the groundwork and lay a strong foundation, but also it should be an ongoing engagement process that's sure that mining companies' commitments that are laid out in their environmental and social development plans are honored. And those include any commitments that relate in particular to impacts on women's livelihoods, their compensation packages, etc. But also any to be mindful and to track any differential impacts that the mining activities may have on women and men, and to make sure that those impacts are addressed in a timely and fair manner. It's also important for us, for example, the MSG and the EITI process more generally can also be helpful for engaging communities, and particular women, in the revenue management and expenditures a little bit further down. So not only at the beginning, but consultations about the revenue management and expenditures, making sure that women can be involved and have access to information about those decisions and discussions and decisions about allocations. For example, we've been working at Ambatovy, we've been working the last couple years with a local NGO that is supporting local communes or local collectivities here, decentralized collectivities, to develop their communal development plans. And we wanted to make sure that for the use of the royalties that our company pays at the decentralized to local regional governments. And we wanted to make sure that that planning process was done in a participatory, inclusive, and transparent and open manner. And the group that the local NGO that we work with had intentional focus groups with women and youth in particular to make sure that their needs, interests, and priorities were taken into consideration in the planning processes to avoid the traps that some of the colleagues from Zambia and South Africa referred to about maybe just consulting elite groups or certain members of communities and not taking everyone's perspectives into consideration. I think another area as well that Ambatovy and other mining companies and can help the MSGs or the National Committee is in tracking employment data, and also I'd widen that to and supply chain data to make it to and being able to disaggregate that along gender lines for employment, as well as how many female-led companies are in our supply chain, so that we and local stakeholders and women in particular can better understand what the benefits of the mining sector are and how they're being shared. We know that we at Ambatovy and other members of the chamber, we know that we'll become stronger, more innovative and resilient companies if we continue to attract people from different backgrounds, different genders, ages, and life experiences. And even though mining is historically has low proportion of women in our industry, our company Ambatovy, we've seen an increase of women in traditional male positions, like technicians, geologists, forestry engineers, millwrights, truck drivers even, and so on. We have approximately 13 to 14% of our direct employees that are women. So I think that the data that comes out of the reports that the EITI reports can, some companies that might already be a priority, but it can shed more light on how women are benefiting from employment opportunities. Are they being excluded? Are there ways that we can more proactively try to recruit women in companies or bring them into the supply chain? And we can
That's fantastic to hear, Winifred, particularly in relation to how the company itself is improving the participation of women as employees, which is something, of course, the current EITI
to the
standard
field
relates to.
Do targeted recruitment
Winifred, I think your
at
internet
technical
is starting
schools.
to cut out. So in any case, we are coming towards the end of the session, and there were some very interesting comments and questions in the chat that I thought we might like to touch on before we conclude. Firstly, just allow me to thank the 4 panelists for those really very useful insights into what improving women's participation has meant from, if you like, a civil society perspective, but also industry perspective. One thing that was asked early on in the chat box was about how women's interest in land is, if you like, respected and recognized by companies when doing those, if you like, environmental impact assessments, gender impact assessments, if it is the case that, as is so often the case, women's legal title it's not formalized. They don't have that legal title. I was wondering, perhaps, Marcel, if we go to you first, and then if Mashudu or Tamika, you've got any reflections from your experience, how do we deal with those situations when we know women are so dependent on the land?
So now I'm going to reveal my novelty in my current job. So I can speak about how we try to identify the challenges, but I gather the question is more about how do we then deal with them. And I'm afraid, seeing that I've only just joined a few weeks ago, I won't have a solid answer on that. So I'm not sure I'll be the best suited to speak to that. Sorry, Lisa.
Sorry, Marcel. Sorry for dropping you in there. Would any of our other panelists like to address that question? Alternatively, any of the other points that were raised in the chat? We do have a few minutes before we need to wrap up, so I'll open it to the panel.
Okay,
Tamika.
sure. Yeah, I can try and summarize the case for Zambia. Like I mentioned earlier, in Zambia, most of the land where mining does occur is customary land in rural areas. And that land is not formally recognized, whether it's owned by a woman or a man. But one way in which to ensure that women's rights and land rights are protected is definitely having a discussion with traditional leaders, because they are the custodians of customary land. So them understanding that they should have a gender lens when they look at land rights, especially broadly, but also when it comes to mining is quite helpful. And so that's how that could be dealt with. And this also comes into play when issues of resettlement come about, because normally you will find that typically it's the male owner of the house who's recognized as the owner of the household, and women are left behind. But I think having conversations with traditional leaders about how they will have a structure to recognize women's rights is very important, because broadly we do have a project as TI Zambia that looks at women's land rights, and there are issues or interventions such as having village registers to address that, and village registers then identify who owns the land, whether it's male or female, and therefore you cater for gender. But also, just to jump in a little bit, I think there was a comment about environmental impacts of mining and do not choose gender. And that is actually, they don't choose gender, but unfortunately, when mining is implemented, it affects the genders differently. And if women are not consulted during the environmental impact assessment stage, even the mitigation measures and plans that are put into place do not address their real issues. So it is different when, say, if I'm a consultant and I just go there and do an EIA, I'm a woman, but if I do not consult the women in that area, I will not know how mining will affect them. So it's something that takes a lot of time and investment, but it's very important to actually invest in consulting the women in that community. And I think we have discussed a lot about how no one community is the same, communities differ across. So I'll just cut myself there and allow others to jump in.
That was brilliant, Tamika. Mashudu, perhaps a final word, and then I'll hand back to Nicole to wrap up.
Yeah, sure. I'll be very, very brief. I think, from a South African perspective, at a policy level, we're in a very interesting moment when it comes to land ownership and exercising participation rights by women and by man-affected communities. There's sort of two main national laws that are conflicting with each other. One speaks about how landowners, particularly in informal areas which mostly house your valuable commodities, where in those areas the community who owns the land, informally so, are the ones who consent to what happens on the land. Whereas the national law, which speaks about or which regulates mining activities in South Africa, doesn't speak about consent, it speaks about engagement. So you have these two sort of national laws that are conflicting, but have a fundamental impact on land ownership and the use and the participation of landowners, and most of the time in informal areas, because you're using the land for agricultural purposes, which are mostly women in South Africa. They are the owners of that land. So it's a very interesting moment, and there's a lot of research that some civil society organizations are doing. So yeah, I just want to put that out there.
Thanks so much, Mashudu, and thanks to all of our panelists. Thanks, Marcel, Tamika, Mashudu, and Winifred, and thanks, Lisa, for moderating. It's been a really broad-ranging discussion, which I think we've all really benefited from, and certainly taking away from it, obviously, the importance of considering gender in the work that we're doing, and particularly from a Transparency International perspective, the relevance of corruption and gender. And how corruption risks can really particularly impact on women and have those quite severe consequences that have been discussed by our panelists today, but also how we need to change processes and systems, and that it's not enough to just have women in the room, but we actually need transformative change and really meaningful change to occur, so that not only are just women present, but they're actually actively engaged and actively considered, included, and able to really meaningfully participate, and that needs to occur at all of the stages of the work that's been discussed today. So hopefully the people who've been attending this session have found the discussion useful, particularly in the context of trying to encourage active engagement from women and diverse groups of women within the processes that you're all involved in. And I'd really encourage you to have a look at some of the resources that we've shared in terms of the work that we've done, and to reach out if you have any further questions. So thanks again, everyone, and looking forward to the next session. Thank you.